The Letters from No One, Chapter 3. The escape of the Brazilian boa constrictor earned Harry his longest ever punishment. By the time he was allowed out of his cupboard again, the summer holidays had started, and Dudley had already broken his new video camera, crashed his remote control airplane, and first time out on his racing bike, knocked down old Miss Fig as she crossed Privet Drive on her crutches. Harry was glad school was over, but there was no escaping Dudley's gang, who visited the house every day. Piers, Dennis, McCullum, and Gordon were all big and stupid, but Dudley was the biggest and the stupidest of the lot, as he was the leader. The rest of them were all quite happy to join Dudley's favorite sport, Harry hunting. This is why Harry spent as much time as possible out of the house, wandering around and thinking about the end of the holidays, where he could see a tiny ray of hope. When September came, he would go off to secondary school, and for the first time in his life, he wouldn't be with Dudley. Dudley had been accepted to Uncle Vernon's old private school, Smeltings. Piers Poluxus was going there too. Harry, on the other hand, was going to Stonewall High, the local public school. Dudley thought this was very funny. They stuffed people's heads down the toilet on the first day at Stonewall, he told Harry. Want to come upstairs and practice? No, thanks, said Harry. The poor toilets never had anything as horrible as your head down it. It might get sick. Then he ran, before Dudley could work out what he said. On the one day in July, Aunt Petunia took Dudley to London to buy his Smeltings uniform, leaving Harry at Mrs. Fig's. Mrs. Fig wasn't as bad as usual. It turned out she had broken her leg tripping over one of her cats, so she didn't seem quite fond of them as before. She let Harry watch television and gave him a bit of chocolate cake that tasted as though she had it for several years. That evening, Dudley trotted around the living room for his family in his brand new uniform. Smelting's boys wore maroon tailcoats, orange knicker bottoms, with flat straw hats called boaters. They also carried around knobby sticks used for hitting each other while the teachers weren't looking. This was supposed to be good training for later life. As he looked at Dudley in his new knicker bottoms, Uncle Vernon said gruffly that it was the proudest moment of his life. Aunt Petunia burst into tears and said she couldn't believe it was her Icky Diddykins. He looked so handsome and grown up. Harry didn't trust himself to speak. He thought two of his ribs might have already cracked from not laughing. There was a horrible smell in the kitchen the next morning when Harry went in for breakfast. It seemed to be coming from the large metal tub in the sink. He went to have a look. The tub was full of what looked like dirty rags swimming in gray water. "What's this?" he asked Aunt Petunia. Her lips tightened as they always did if he dared to ask a question. "Your new school uniform," she said. Harry looked into the bowl again. "Oh," he said. "I didn't realize it had to be so wet." "Don't be stupid," snapped Aunt Petunia. "I'm dyeing some of Dudley's old things gray for you. It'll look just like everyone else's when I'm finished." Harry seriously doubted this, but it was best not to argue. He sat down at the table and tried not to think about how he was going to look on his first day at Stonewall High. Like he was wearing bits of old elephant skin, probably. Dudley and Uncle Vernon came in, both wearing wrinkled noses because of the smell of Harry's new uniform. Uncle Vernon opened his newspaper as usual, and Dudley banged his smelting stick, which he carried everywhere, on the table. They heard a click of the mail slot and flop of letters on the doormat. "Get the mail, Dudley," said Uncle Vernon from behind his paper. "Make Harry get it." "Get the mail, Harry." "Make Dudley get it. Poke him with your smelting sticks, Dudley." Harry dodged the smelting stick and went to get the mail. Three things lay on the doormat: a postcard from Uncle Vernon's sister Marge, who was vacationing on the Isle of Wight, a brown envelope that looked like a bill, and a letter for Harry. Harry picked it up and stared at it, his heart twangling like a giant elastic band. No one would ever in his whole life had written for him. Who would? He had no friends, no other relatives. He didn't belong to the library, so he had never even gotten any rude notes asking for books back. Yet here it was, a letter addressed to him so plainly that there could be no mistake. "Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whining, Surrey." The envelope was thick and heavy and made of yellowish parchment. The address was written with emerald green ink. There was no stamp. Turning the envelope over, his hand trembling, he saw a purple wax seal bearing the bearing a coat of arms, a lion, an eagle, a badger, a snake, and a snake surrounding the letter H. "Hurry up, boy!" shouted Uncle Vernon from the kitchen. "What are you doing, checking the letter for bombs?" He chuckled at his own joke. Harry went back into the kitchen, still staring at his letter. He handed Uncle Vernon the bill and the postcard, and sat down, slowly began to open the yellow envelope. Uncle Vernon ripped open the bill, snorted in disgust, and flipped over the postcard. "Marge is ill," he informed Aunt Petunia. "Ate a funny whelk." "Dad!" said Dudley suddenly. "Dad, Harry's got something!" Harry was on the point of unfolding his letter, which was written on the same heavy parchment as the envelope, and when it was jerked sharply out of his hand by Uncle Vernon. "That's mine," said Harry, trying to snatch it back. "Who'll be riding to you?" sneered Uncle Vernon, shaking the letter open with one hand and glancing at it. His face went from red to green faster than the set of traffic lights. And it didn't stop there. Within seconds it was grayish white with old porridge. "Petunia!" he gasped. Dudley tried to grab the letter to read it, but Uncle Vernon held it tight out of his reach. Aunt Petunia took it curiously and read the first line. For a moment she looked as though she might faint. She clutched her throat, began making a choking noise. "Vernon! Oh my goodness, Vernon!" They stared at each other and it seemed forgotten that Harry and Dudley were still in the room. Dudley wasn't used to being ignored. He gave his father a sharp tap on the head with his smelting stick. "I want to read the letter," he said louder. "I want to read it," said Harry furiously, "as it's mine." "Get out, both of you!" croaked Uncle Vernon, stuffing the letter back into his envelope. Harry didn't move. "I want my letter!" he shouted. "Let me see it!" demanded Dudley. "Ouch!" roared Uncle Vernon as he took both Harry and Dudley by the scruffs of their neck and threw them into the hall, slamming the kitchen door behind them. Harry and Dudley promptly had a furious but silent fight over who would listen in the keyhole. Dudley won, so Harry, his glasses dangling from one ear, lay flat on his stomach to listen at the crack between the door and the floor. "Vernon," Aunt Petunia was saying with a quivering voice, "look at the address. How could they possibly know where he sleeps? You don't think they're watching the house? Watching, spying, might be following us," muttered Uncle Vernon wildly. "But what should we do, Vernon? Should we write back? Tell them we don't want—" Harry could see Uncle Vernon's shiny black shoes pacing up and down the kitchen. "No," he said finally. "No, we'll ignore it. If they don't get an answer, yeah, that's best. We won't do anything. But I'm not having one in the house, Petunia. Didn't we swear when we took him in that we'd stamp out that dangerous nonsense?" That evening, when he got back from work, Uncle Vernon did something he had never done before. He visited Harry in his cupboard. "Where's my letter?" said Harry the moment Uncle Vernon had squeezed through the door. "Who's writing to me?" "No one. It was addressed to you by mistake," said Uncle Vernon shortly. "I've burned it." "It was not a mistake," said Harry angrily. "It had my cupboard on it." "Silence!" yelled Uncle Vernon, and a couple of spiders fell from the ceiling. He took a few deep breaths and then forced a smile on his face, which looked quite painful. Yes, Harry, about this cupboard. Your aunt and I have been thinking. You're really getting big for it. We think that it might be nice if you moved into Dudley's second bedroom." "Why? Don't ask questions," snapped his uncle. "Take this stuff upstairs, now." The Dursley house had 4 bedrooms, one for Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia, one for visitors, usually Uncle Vernon's sister Marge, one where Dudley slept, and one where Dudley kept all of his toys and things that wouldn't fit into his first bedroom. It only took Harry one trip upstairs to move everything he owned from the cupboard into this room. He sat down on the bed, stared around him. Nearly everything in here was broken. The month-old video camera was lying on the top of a small working tank Dudley had once driven over to the next-door neighbor's dog. In the corner was Dudley's first-ever television set, which he put his foot through, and his favorite program had been canceled. There was a large bird case which once held a parrot that Dudley had swapped at school for a real air rifle, which was on top of a shelf and all bent up because Dudley sat on it. Other shelves were full of books. They were the only things in the room that looked as though they had never been touched. From downstairs came a sound of Dudley bawling at his mother. "I don't want him in there. I need that room. Make him get out." Harry sighed and stretched out of the bed. Yesterday he had given anything to be up here. Today he'd rather be back in his cupboard with that letter than up here without it. Next morning at breakfast, everyone was rather quiet. Dudley was in shock. He screamed and whacked his father with his smelting stick, been sick on purpose, kicked his mother, and thrown his tortoise through the greenhouse roof, and he still didn't have his room back. Harry was thinking about this time yesterday, and bitterly wishing he had opened the letter in the hall. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia kept looking at each other darkly. When the mail arrived, Uncle Vernon, who seemed to be trying to be nice to Harry, made Dudley go and get it. He heard them banging things with his smelting stick all the way down the hall. Then he shouted, "There's another one, Mr. H. Potter, the smallest bedroom, 4 Privet Drive." With a strangled cry, Uncle Vernon leapt from his seat and ran down the hall, Harry right behind him. Uncle Vernon had to wrestle Dudley to the ground to get the letter from him, which was made difficult by the fact that Harry had grabbed Uncle Vernon around the neck from behind. After a minute of confused fighting, in which everyone got hit a lot by his smelting stick, Uncle Vernon straightened up, grasping for breath, with Harry's letter clutched in his hand. "Go to your cupboard. I mean, your bedroom," he wheezed at Harry. "Dudley, go. Just go." Harry walked around his new room. Someone knew he had moved out of his cupboard, and they seemed to know that he hadn't received his first letter. Surely that meant that they'd try again, and this time he'd make sure that they didn't fail. He had a plan. The repaired alarm clocks rang at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock the next morning. Harry turned it off quickly and dressed silently. He mustn't wake the Dursleys. He stole downstairs without turning on any of the lights. He was going to wait for the postman at the corner of Privet Drive to get the letters for number 4 first. His heart hammered as he crept across the dark hallway toward the front door. Arrgh! Harry leapt into the air. He trod on something big and squishy on the doormat, something alive. Lights clicked on upstairs, and to his horror, Harry realized that a big squashy something he had stepped on was his uncle's face. Uncle Vernon had been lying on the floor. Where was I? In a sleeping bag, clearly making sure that Harry didn't know exactly what he had been trying to do. He shouted at Harry for half an hour, and then told him to go and make a cup of tea. Harry shuffled miserably off into the kitchen, and by the time he got back, the mail had arrived, right into Uncle Vernon's lap. Harry could see 3 letters addressed in green ink. He began, but Uncle Vernon was tearing the letters in pieces before his eyes. Uncle Vernon didn't go to work that day. He stayed at home and nailed up the mail slot. "See," he explained to Aunt Petunia through the mouthful of nails, "if they can't deliver them, they'll just give up." "I'm not sure that'll work, Vernon." "Oh, these people's minds work in strange ways, Petunia. They're not like you and me," said Uncle Vernon, trying to knock a nail with a piece of fruit cake Uncle Vernon had just brought him. On Friday, no less than 12 letters arrived to Harry. As they couldn't go through the mail slot, they had been pushed under the door, slotted through the sides, and a few even forced through the small windows in the downstairs bathroom. Uncle Vernon stayed home again. After burning all the letters, he got a hammer and nails and boarded up all the cracks around the front and back doors so no one could get out. He hummed Tiptoe Through the Tulips as he worked, and jumped at small noises. On Saturday, things seemed to get out of hand. 24 letters to Harry found their way to the house, rolled up and hidden inside each of the 24 eggs that their confused milkman had handed Petunia through the living room window. While Uncle Vernon had made a furious telephone calls to the post office and the dairy trying to find someone to complain to, Aunt Petunia shredded the letters in her food processor. Who on earth wants to talk to you this badly? Uncle Vernon. "Dudley," asked Harry in amazement. On Sunday morning, Uncle Vernon sat down on the breakfast table, and he looked tired and rather ill, but happy. "No post on Sundays," he reminded them cheerfully as he spread marmalade on his newspapers. "No dang letters today." Something came whizzing down the kitchen chimney as he spoke, and caught him sharply on the back of the head. Next moment, 30 or 40 letters came pelting out of the fireplace like bullets. The Dudleys ducked, but Harry leapt into the air, trying to catch one. "Ouch! Ouch!" Uncle Vernon seized Harry around the waist and threw him into the hall. When Aunt Petunia and Dudley had run out with their arms over their faces, Uncle Vernon slammed the door shut. They could hear the letter still streaming into the room, bouncing off the walls and floor. "That does it," said Uncle Vernon, trying to speak calmly, but pulling great tufts out of his mustache at the same time. "I want you all back here in 5 minutes, ready to leave. We're going away. Just pack some clothes. No arguments." He looked as dangerous with half of his mustache missing that no one dared argue. 10 minutes later, they had all wrenched their way into the boarded up doors and were in the car, speeding down the highway. Dudley was snuffling in the back seat. His father had hit him around the head for holding them up while he tried to pack his television, VCR, and computer in his sports bag. They drove, and they drove. And even Aunt Petunia didn't dare ask where they were going. Every now and then, Uncle Vernon would make a sharp turn and drive the opposite direction for a while. Shake 'em off, he would mutter whenever he did this. They didn't stop to eat or drink all day. By nightfall, Dudley was howling. He had never had such a bad day in his life. He was hungry. He had missed 5 television programs he wanted to see, and he had never gone so long without blowing up and ailing on his computer. Uncle Vernon stopped at the last outside, glummy-looking hotel on the outskirts of the big city. Dudley and Harry shared a room of twin beds and damp, musty sheets. Dudley snored, but Harry stayed awake, sitting on the windowsill, staring down at the lights of passing cars and wondering. They ate stale cornflakes and cold tinned tomatoes on toast for the breakfast the next day. They had just finished when the owner of the hotel came to their table. "Excuse me, but is one of you Mr. H. Potter? Only got about 100 of these at the front desk." She held up the letter so they could see green ink and address to Mr. H. Potter, Room 17, Railview Hotel, Cokeworth. Harry made a grab for the letter, but Uncle Vernon knocked his hand out of the way. The woman stared. "I'll take 'em," said Uncle Vernon, straddling up quickly and following her into the dining room. "Wouldn't it be better to just go home, dear?" Aunt Petunia suggested timidly hours later, but Uncle Vernon didn't seem to want to hear her. Exactly what he was looking for, none of them knew. He drove into the middle of a forest, got out, looked around, shook his head, got back in the car, and they went off again. The same thing happened in the middle of a plowed field, halfway across suspension bridge, and at the top of a multi-field parking garage. "Daddy's gone mad, hasn't he?" Dudley asked Aunt Petunia dully later that afternoon. Uncle Vernon had parked at the coast, locking them all inside the car, and disappeared. It started to rain. Great drops beat on the roof of the car. Dudley snarled. Hope you enjoy! By J.K. Rowling. Sorry, I'm sick. Next chapter in 4 days. Next part of chapter 3 in 2 hours.